Okay, you want me to roll?
Yeah, you're rolling.
Okay.
This is not an anti-medical model film. There is much about the medical model that was intended to be artful, a practice, an exploration. But as it has become more embedded, many of us have been hurt, and fewer of our voices have been heard.
I was kind of fooled because I was supposedly going to see the doctor just so that I can meet the doctor who's gonna help me. And yep, that was the same doctor that left me for 2 months in the hospital. So, after that, when I got out, I realized that I don't want to live like that.
When we talk about the medical model of mental illness, we are referring to the view that the emotional distress and the ways we've acted when we felt distressed are the result of a disease caused largely by chemical imbalances or other problems residing in our brains. Under the framework of this model, the individual's internal workings are the primary focus. The impact from environment and relationships are considered secondary, or sometimes not considered at all, and medication and hospitalization are viewed as first-line defenses. While some find solace within the medical model, many find that it simply doesn't fit with their sense of self. Unfortunately, because our belief system is so dominated by this model, devaluation of those who see things differently has become commonplace.
There was a Surgeon General's report on mental health that came out, and I read the whole thing. I'll just briefly say this about it. At the time that the Surgeon General's report on mental health came out, they put forth press releases saying that we now know that mental illnesses are diseases like any other disease or any other illness. In other words, the headlines that were put forth, they assumed people weren't going to read the 400 or 500-page report, which wasn't written by the Surgeon General. It was written by many psychiatrists and psychologists who submitted to the Surgeon General. It was compiled as this long report. So the press releases that were given out to major news organizations led to this repetition, this parroting of the idea that science has shown, we now know that people's emotional problems really are diseases, like any other disease. In reading the Surgeon General's report, you found that there were repeatedly clear statements saying that these things we call mental disorders, we've never been able to establish any biological substrate. We've never been able to point to a lesion, that is a break in physical tissue or a malfunctioning tissue, that we could pinpoint as being the source of it.
A growing number of critical psychiatrists in England has said, biological psychiatry is subjective opinion masquerading as a fact. And, the reality is there is no evidence that these illnesses exist. But despite this, people are forced to take medication they may not want to take, have their liberty taken away, and have these biological illnesses imposed on them. And I think it's hugely damaging, and actually, ultimately, it's a human rights issue.
I was at Hartford Hospital in the Institute of Living, and somewhere around 1990, a psychologist who had been on a committee left. He was going to retire, and I ended up taking over his committee membership on something called an institutional review board. And an institutional review board is one of the oversight committees for research done at hospitals or universities. In the 20 years that I was on that committee, I would repeatedly see the background manuals, the hundreds of pages that researchers submitted talking about, say, with schizophrenia or with what we call depression, that is sadness or somebody being demoralized. These researchers would accurately say to each other that we have no biological substrate for these conditions that we really know is a biological marker or is the cause of these disorders. That is, we've never known that schizophrenia was a brain disease. And the same goes for all the labels that we use in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which has at times been called the Bible of psychiatry. And some people joke that it's called the Bible because it's religion and not science.
In spite of this lack of evidence to support the medical model as such an unquestionable approach, people continue to have their experiences defined as an illness in almost all instances.
When I was first starting to go into like hospitals and stuff, I didn't really know like what was wrong with me, I guess. I kind of like had to see it through what they said because I was kind of new at the whole thing, as weird as that may sound. But of course, I mean, we trust doctors. We don't trust them, but we value their opinion because they have the stuff to go along with them. They have the letters at the end of their name, so why can't we value their opinion? But I think that they aren't right all of the time. I think that I felt a lot like stigmatized and judged and kind of like, this is what you have and it's always going to be there, and you're labeled with your diagnosis, which is not cool because it kind of stunts the growth towards recovery, I think.
It is often seen as so bizarre to question this model or to claim not to be mentally ill once you've been diagnosed, that the mere denial of this belief system can be seen as proof that you are, in fact, sick and in need of help.
So I think that people who identify willingly with the medical model have a certain degree of privilege, and I think that's a little bit of a funny word because I'm not sure that it helps them in the end, but they are the people who are less likely to be referred to as in denial or lacking insight. They're more likely to be seen as having a good prognosis, so to speak. And one of the best examples I can think of this is when I was in a courtroom. A woman I know had asked me to come and support her when she went through a commitment hearing. She was on the stand and the lawyer for the hospital was questioning her. And this lawyer was asking her whether or not she believed she had a mental illness pretty much over and over. It was just really staggering to me that that was seen as the proof of whether or not she needed to be committed.
Individuals who refuse to accept the medical model and their diagnoses or recommended treatments can be subject to real losses in their lives. These losses can include an inability to access system supports and services.
Especially when checking into a hospital or trying to get Social Security, for example. I felt like I had to explain it in terms of medicine, to say, like, you know, I'm taking these medications, I'm not feeling well. Perhaps it's because the medications aren't working anymore, even though it might not have been clear to me whether the medications were ever working.
Losses can also include one's job or professional career.
From 2005 till 2007, I tried to dance with the Board of Registration in Medicine around what had happened to me in 2003 that left me with a 5-day psychiatric hospitalization, and keeping my medical license and going back into the fold as a licensed physician. I left in disgust. I had come through my own crisis pretty intact, but what the Board of Registration in Medicine did with respect to shaming and with respect to blaming and with respect to not one, not two, but 3 psychiatric evaluations, all of them saying I was competent to practice medicine, I see as totally unforgivable and bizarre. And therefore, I really do believe that the current mainstream culture has a vested interest in keeping stories like mine away from people's ears, that you don't want to think of anybody who has a professional degree as ever having problems, ever having their own crises. So I would say an emphatic yes to have I been pushed by the conventional model to accept their way of looking at the world.
Loss of children and families.
The medical model sort of got incorporated into law, right? So you'll have pressure on parents, for example, if they don't want to medicate their kids. They get pressure almost to have the threat of the kid taken away from them, etc., if they won't medicate, because the idea is you're not giving medical care to your kid, right? Your kid has a disease, ADHD. A stimulant is a drug for that disorder. And if you're the parent that says, well, listen, I don't want to give my kid a stimulant and show me the evidence where it helps long term and they can't do it, that isn't even part of the discussion. I can tell you, I know parents get pressured all the time to put their kids on ADHD medications. That's an example.
And for those who are given serious psychiatric diagnosis, the refusal to accept the medical model can lead to a loss of freedom altogether.
I ended up in the New York State prison system, the correction system, where I had already had a psychiatric label, so I was forced into a psychiatric hospital inside a prison, where if you do not accept, quote unquote, the medical model diagnosis, you won't get out and you won't move on to general populations and other places. Through court hearings as well, medication over objection hearings, as well as retention hearings, you're forced to accept the medical model, and that is to have insight into your quote-unquote illness.
The first time I ever saw a therapist, I was 16, and being naive and very unfamiliar with the workings of the physical world or the social paradigm, I was very honest, and the psychiatrist asked me if I heard voices, and I said, yeah. And do you see lights? And I said, well, yeah. And they says, what kind of lights? I said, well, I see lights around people and plants and things. And they asked me what kind of voices I heard, and I said, well, mostly dead people. And like my relatives and ancestors, because I grew up in a Roma, pagan kind of household back then, which was kind of held under wraps. It wasn't a good thing to let out. But the next thing I knew, I was asked to come in to do some tests into the hospital, and I signed the papers, and I didn't get a hospital bed. I got a psych ward. And then I met people in there that were there for, years and never got out. So it was my first experience with the medical model.
One has to wonder why we have allowed this model, to the exclusion of all other viewpoints, to dominate our world.
If you go back to the history of psychiatry, that there was this brain disease which was caused by syphilis, and then the early pioneers in psychiatry thought, well, there is this kind of biological problem, and from that they deduced that there was something called schizophrenia. So in fact we've spent over 100 years with biological psychiatry trying to prove that it is a biological illness, that it's a genetic illness, but yet despite the fact we've spent millions and millions of pounds and dollars trying to prove this genetic theory, they've yet to find a gene to prove that there is this thing called schizophrenia. I think we should ask for our money back, personally.
Dr. Daniel Dorman, psychiatrist and author of Dante's Cure, was once quoted as saying, "If even one apple fell up, wouldn't we have to at least begin to question the laws of physics? In the face of hundreds of thousands of apples, it is time to begin questioning." One of the most well-established alternative perspectives is the social model of trauma. As opposed to medical models that look primarily within a person at their biology and physiology, social models look at people in relationship to their surroundings.
One of the predominant models is a trauma model. Many people have had very difficult life experiences, things like abuse and the experience of early separation from loved ones, consequences of bereavement, social problems, poverty, racism, all of these kinds of experiences, difficulties in families, dysfunctional families, problems in families. So for some people there's a very clear trauma. Something like childhood sexual abuse is a clear trauma. But for other people, I think it's lots of cumulative things that have really eroded their sense of self.
It seems like all my issues stem from social atmosphere. and all the things that I've been through in my life, have been very extreme trauma.
And if you hear people who have gone through the psychiatric system and who are later stable in their life, many times you hear them off the cuff mentioning, well, I got a job, I got an apartment, but also I dealt with the fact that I'd been sexually abused as a kid, or I dealt with the fact that I'd been repeatedly beaten up by a drunken parent as a child, or that I'd been bullied relentlessly.
The most extreme trauma that affected me was when I was 4.5 in a kindergarten, and I was raised in an environment, where there weren't too many black people. In kindergarten, I had ended up with a very racist teacher, older. She was very old, and she was stuck in her ways, and I was treated every day for that year. I was treated, as less than. I mean, really like I was an animal or something, and I think that's what had the most extreme effect on me, which continued all my life, because I never really dealt with it. And it was so many degrading things that I went through. I believe that's when I started the development of hearing voices.
I've never seen anybody who had really serious problems or really serious issues or in a really extreme state who didn't have some extremely painful and difficult history. Never seen it.
So for me, things like voices and visions and other kind of unusual sensory experiences come out of extreme life events. And I would very much reframe them as essential coping strategies, survival strategies. And I think it's really tragic that we try and suppress that knowledge. What I would like people to be doing is actually saying, wow, you've been to hell and back. And you've developed these extra capacities to enable you to survive. What can you tell us about humanity? What can you tell us about human experience?
Referring to our distress as being the result of trauma is not just a nicer or more politically correct way to say someone has a mental illness. Trauma survivor is not a euphemism for mentally ill. This model is a wholly separate way to understand our experiences.
I believe in the social model of trauma, of how it has impacted my life and how it has caused struggles in my life and how I've had to cope with things. So people that have labeled me with particular diagnoses, I just kind of throw them out the window.
With the trauma model, it is assumed that individuals have been impacted by negative experiences that have shaped the ways in which they interact with the world.
I thought of myself as crazy for a lot of years, and then did a lot of different healing modalities and started to think, no, I'm not crazy, I've just had experiences that I need to heal from. And then had this really over-the-top trauma memory stuff come back out of, after I was sober a couple of years, it just sort of started to emerge. I think it was safe, I was grounded enough that it could start to come out.
Although not as widely recognized as the medical model, research supporting this perspective is actually quite extensive.
The Adverse Childhood Experience Study, more commonly referred to as the ACE study, is a collaborative research project between the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Kaiser Permanente. The two principal investigators are Dr. Rob Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti. And what they looked at is the experiences of children in their childhood, adverse experiences, and how they were correlated. Actually, a very significant graded correlation to long-term health.
Set up the study, which studied 17,000 people who were receiving services from Kaiser in Southern California, and this was primarily a middle-class area. And the people responded to a series of questions about their childhoods, various childhood traumatic experiences, and then the evaluators looked at those people's mental and physical health records throughout the lifespan. So for some, they had 50 to 60 years of records, and statistically what it showed, for example, when they looked at who becomes an intravenous drug user, basically they found that 17,000 times more likely to be an IV drug user if you had 4 or 5 adverse childhood experiences than if you had none. And those kinds of correlations in research have never been approached before. They kept expanding that, and for example, they've done the correlations with childhood trauma and hallucinations, because previously delusions and hallucinations were seen as markers of purely biological psychiatric illnesses. And you've had people say, well, those, quote, delusions and hallucinations are meaningless, you don't have to attend to what they're saying. Well, now we know, because of the histories of childhood trauma, every one of those has meaning to that person. It's a way of they're trying to cope and process and make meaning of their childhoods.
In spite of all the evidence, this model continues to be dramatically under-recognized. It seems common practice to disregard that for many people healing may best be supported, either in the absence of a medical perspective or at least in collaboration between the two. Another model worth considering is the social model of extreme states. This model is referred to by any number of names or by no clear name at all, and is harder to conceptualize due to its expansive and inclusive nature.
The reality is that the mind is much, much more mysterious, that what we call madness or mental illness is a very rich, complicated question. And I really think that it's up to the individual to sort of explore and discover what that means for themselves, because it's not so much a medical or a scientific question as it is a philosophical question, or a religious and a spiritual question, a moral and existential question. Who am I? How do I make sense of why I'm here on this planet? What does my suffering mean? What is my purpose? What do I want to do? What are my values? And I think that there's a huge amount of anthropological literature, there's a huge amount of research, cross-cultural research, that shows that many, many societies view what we call mental illness and madness from a spiritual perspective. They see it as disconnecting with the ancestors. They see it as being initiated into the role of a medicine person or a shaman, or having special gifts and talents that maybe you're overwhelmed by, that you don't know how to use. Maybe they seem like they're coming from the outside and attacking you. But if you can learn how to collaborate them and learn from them and explore and discover, and most important of all, get help and support, that these can actually be the sources of tremendous strength.
People use all their different history, ethnic background, religious background, ways of thinking, styles of making sense of things as a way to make sense of madness experiences, just as they do to make sense of any other kinds of experiences.
Although more difficult to define, it is clear that not everyone's experiences fit into either the medical or trauma models. While trauma may still be seen as a piece of the puzzle, other factors like individual sensitivities to elements such as nutrition, supernatural causes, and spiritual emergency can also be primary.
There are a whole load of other people that, are much more interested in kind of spiritual explanations, and other people that are interested in kind of more paranormal explanations, so things like gods and spirits and past lives and a whole load of different things. Some people believe they're in touch with alien forces from other planets, and I guess for me, I may not share those ideas or those beliefs, but there's lots of ideas and beliefs in the world that I don't share, and I guess within the context of people's mental health, what I'm most interested in is the impact that those ideas have on their life. And I don't see it as my job or my right to impose my models and my ways of making sense on anyone. I think people have had enough of that.
Individuals who resonate with this model may see distress as episodic and may define recovery as not so much eliminating all unusual experiences, but rather learning how to integrate them. One of the perspectives within the extreme states model that is quickly gaining recognition is spiritual emergency.
I am so blessed to, even my choice of words, I am so blessed to have known the term spiritual emergency before I ever had one in my own life. I define spiritual emergency as a time where your life is overwhelming and you cannot make meaning for yourself with the tools that are in your particular toolbox of coping mechanisms. So a spiritual emergency for me was a time where what was happening for me in my professional life, in my relationship life, partnering, in my family of origin, all came to the perfect storm at the same moment. And spiritual emergency also very easily breaks down to spirit, emerge, and see. And I believe that people who are offered pathways through spiritual emergencies can come out more whole than they entered that dark night of the soul.
People who identify with this perspective may see their experiences less as a problem unto themselves and more as a problem in relationship to how society sees them. A key part of healing then becomes learning to integrate those experiences in a way that still allows the individual to comfortably walk through this world.
Spiritual emergency for me is basically a breaking through from the supposed the consensus reality into other states of reality or experience. And the emergency is when, for me, when you make you have the epiphany that the other states of consciousness are just as valid as this one that everyone else could see. And that's when, for me, a spiritual emergency is when you begin the process of integrating all that you experience and bring it into a certain wholeness. Then it becomes a process. It becomes a journey that you, every day, every week, every month, you integrate more and more of all your experiences, eventually without shame or blame or diagnosis, and make it part of the whole you're becoming, and you walk in this world aware of more worlds than just this one, whether the rest of this world doesn't see it or hear it, so you come to some level of comfort walking both worlds.
Evidence for this perspective includes those studies that support the idea that experiences so often labeled as mental illness can, in fact, be episodic or short-term issues, provided individuals are supported to understand and move through them.
Beginning in 1969, the World Health Organization began conducting studies comparing outcomes for schizophrenia patients in 3 developing countries, and that was India, Colombia, and Nigeria, with outcomes in the U.S. and I think it was 6 other developed countries. One was a 2-year study and one was a 5-year study. And what they found both times was that outcomes were much, much better in the poor countries of the world, in the developing countries. And they actually concluded, based on this, is that living in a developed country is a strong predictor you'll never fully recover from schizophrenia. So the question is, well, why is that? Now, one of the things you noticed back then is that the use of medications was different. So they did use the medications in the developing country to help them get over this sort of the acute crisis, but only 16% of the patients were regularly maintained on the drugs there in the poor countries. Whereas, of course, long-term maintenance is what is the paradigm of care here in the United States and other developed countries. So where did we see the best outcomes? We saw it in countries where they were using the drugs by and large on a short-term basis. And by the way, the outcomes by far were the best in rural India, where virtually no one was maintained on the medications long-term. Now, there's other thing that's happened 25 years later, and this is really key. They went back and revisited those initial cohorts, okay, those same group of people. And they found in the developed countries, again, in the developing countries, they had much, much better long-term outcomes. And you know what they found? It was something like more than 60% were just not ill anymore. They just weren't schizophrenic anymore. In other words, they had had a schizophrenic time in their life. But they, by and large, were doing quite well. There's a beautiful line at one point when I was doing Anatomy of an Epidemic. It was Samuel Bachelven said, he says, "My experience tells me that mental disorders are largely episodic in kind unless we do something to make them chronic by taking away liberty, etc., with our treatments." Now, what happened with Anatomy of an Epidemic? It's been really interesting, actually. And the first time there was a really vicious attack launched when the book came out, and it was meant to marginalize. It was a review in the Boston Globe by a doctor with Harvard credentials. He says sleep specialist, pediatric sleep specialist. Anyway, it was vicious. It compared me to an AIDS denier. Think about marginalizing someone. Then it compared me to a South African dictator who, by denying AIDS, had caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. So this was a message in my hometown newspaper saying, don't listen to this guy, he's a crackpot, right? That's really what it was. So that's not even marginalizing, that's just an attempt to discredit.
So, the question then becomes, why does there continue to be so much resistance to broadening our view? Why, when one speaks of these alternatives, are they so likely to be written off as anti-psychiatry, too radical, or crazy themselves?
In 2010, I had 2 miscarriages, and then in 2011, I found myself pregnant for a 3rd time. And it was such a hard period of my life. Having had these 2 miscarriages felt really traumatic. And so I was not in a good place. And I went to this new doctor, new obstetrician, and I was telling her, can you please reassure me that the baby's there, because my brain is telling me that the baby disappears. I can feel the baby kick, and then I think the baby's gone, and I can't get out of that loop with myself, and it's just what I'm obsessing over all day long. And I thought for sure that she would look at me and say, that makes sense. You had a really traumatic year, and your reaction makes sense. But instead she asked me what kind of medication I was taking for that. And I just was so shocked that someone was so stuck in that place that they couldn't understand how painful that had been, and that my reaction made sense.
People became invested in a certain story, okay? And people from many different walks of life, psychiatrists, behavioral health care workers, hospital attendants, state offices of mental health, patients, family members, they all became invested in a story that was told to be true, and they began to organize their lives and services around that truth, right? These are brain diseases, and by the way, so these are brain diseases, the drugs help fix that, and this is the model of care we have. And it became our way of understanding distress, okay, and mental states. And people have got degrees based on this, they have professions based on this, and families operate on it, and then we have self-perceptions. And now you're asking people to say, well, listen, that's probably all bullshit.
I think there's a lot of reasons why the medical model remains so powerful and so entrenched. First of all is money. It's a huge economic apparatus with influence in the media, influence over doctors, influence over the research establishment, and it's become a profit-making business, and that's always something that's difficult to challenge.
And so when someone is going through a very distressing experience, naturally they turn to whatever seems most available in the culture as a way to understand. So if they're seeing things that they never saw before, that other people in the room say aren't there, or they're hearing voices, and they say, my God, what's wrong with me? And a psychiatrist says to them, you have a mental illness called schizophrenia that is causing you to have something called hallucinations. That's a framework that at least sounds as if it makes sense, even if it's unfortunately not clearly based on scientific knowledge and doesn't really contribute very much to helping the person cope with those experiences.
The market for psychiatric drugs is over $40 billion a year in this country. that greases a lot of belief systems. So if you had $40 billion greasing the alternative ideas, right, it would be much easier to shift. But our financial forces are towards maintaining this other belief system, the medical model system.
We've been fed a misleading line, the medical model type arguments that have been made have often been made as if they were scientifically justified. If you're told, by well-respected news commentators at the New York Times, the Washington Post, public TV, etc., that we now know that these problems are all biologically based. When you see lots of thought leaders, lots of key psychiatrists who come out and tell you repeatedly in the media that these are all biological disorders, well, most people think these authority figures must know what they're talking about.
And I don't think people can surrender to that idea that well-intentioned people, highly educated people, credentialed people who paid a lot of money and took a lot of time and energy to achieve those credentials have lost their way and missed the mark. It's going to be, there's some really courageous folks leading the way from within those professions, and I think we need to bring folks together, and we need to teach, especially the academics, about this first, because we are now just undoing and undoing and undoing. The people making the changes are undoing what's still being taught in many places. And we need to come together as a community of people who care about this issue and start helping the providers heal. And that's about one of the most radical things I think I could ever suggest.
This is not an anti-medical model film. This is an anti-model film. This is not about stepping outside of one box only to step into another. It's about getting rid of all boxes, broadening our understanding, and when we find ourselves too stuck in any one perspective, simply asking ourselves, why?
What I've learned from years of studying these first-person accounts, teaching students at Mount Holyoke who are studying psychology from the point of view of these first-person narratives, and from all the work I've done in the Hearing Voices Network and with other peer support groups like the RLC, I've learned that people's own experiences make sense within the framework of their own lives. And although, of course, there are models of many different kinds that we can apply to understanding them. We can apply psychoanalytic models, we can apply medical model, we can apply spirituality models, we can apply all kinds of different points of view. I think all of them suffer from the problem that they try to frame someone's experience in a way that is probably different from how the person themselves understands what they're going through.
The models have affected me in that I've had to contemplate, do they apply to me? Does this model help me make sense of my experience? And I haven't really found a model that I had total confidence in.
I really don't see a need to cut out any one perspective entirely. I've found value in looking at it through a variety of lenses.
Throughout this film, we focus primarily on how we understand the road that has led people to the experiences so commonly labeled as mental illness. Our intent was not to provide a definitive answer about how these experiences should be understood, but rather to raise questions and share information. We've talked about past hurts and current challenges, but we can't fully draw to a close without touching at least briefly on all the hope that we have for the future, that can be found in our stories, and that exists simply because people are now having this conversation with more and more frequency.
Mad in America was picked by Discover magazine as one of the best science books that year, and the American Library Association picked it as one of the best, I think, history books that year. I'd say more important, Anatomy of an Epidemic. It's so contrary to what society knows to be true. That was named by the Investigative Reporters and Editors Association, which is an association formed by journalists and editors at like the New York Times, 60 Minutes. So anyway, they named Anatomy of an Epidemic as the best book of 2010 for investigative journalism.
Part of my mission is to go out there and stand up and say, I hear voices, I've had lots of unusual experiences in my life, and I lead a good life. It's cool.
I've been in love with somebody for the past 5 years, and recently got married.
One specific piece that happened to me was walking around a prison yard fence. My good friend, who's locked up still today, said to me, "We are who we are. We're not these labels and these diagnoses and these things that they like to perpetuate us to be." I think that was a defining moment for me, that I would leave the prison system and the psychiatric system behind me and connect with just community and human beings, and really be a part of other people's lives who experience this this labeling of people.
It's the Hearing Voices movement.
The Hearing Voices approach.
By the growth of Hearing Voices groups.
The National Hearing Voices Network.
And the Hearing Voices group.
The Hearing Voices movement that happened in England is starting to take hold here.
Where I was at in the past is like, I never thought I would live past 25 years old. And here I am. I'm not going to say how old I am, but
in a really loud, very clear, very rational way, a lot of people all over the world, connected by all sorts of modern media, are saying the exact same stuff. We want our human rights, we want our basic human dignity respected, we want alternatives, we want choices, we want options to do what we want, and not only that, we can prove that what we want is the best for so many people, because look, it worked for me, it worked for me, it worked for me, and there's all these interconnected movements that have a lot of power, that really are offering a massively true alternative model to traditional psychiatry and traditional mental health. And when I hear these groups, and I hear their passion, and I hear their insight, and I hear their intelligence, in spite of the horrors that they've been through, I feel hope, and I feel like these people could actually change something. These people could really do something. And in fact, more and more I realize I'm actually one of these people. I'm one of them. This is my movement.
People are whole even though they're wounded. People are strong and not broken.
People being able to come to a place like the RLC and connect with other humans that have compassion and can help them feel a sense of hope for their own healing. It just makes so much sense. It's just unbelievable when you think of the history of mental illness and the fact that, that's not going to be the story. Generations from now, they're not going to have that story. It's like, yes.
That's about it.
That's it. You did it.
I'm expected to, and you're expected, yes, you, by those who follow through with what they were expected to, connected to an impression we all can do. Meet me at the gate. We get lost along the way. I wish that you could see the work it took to get to me, the history, and the record will show our lives wouldn't be what they are now if they weren't what they were then. It's everyone that makes the day. It's not just one lone person who bursts in, and the chorus goes on and on. She said all along, you're gonna miss me when I'm gone. The meter length and pace, and all of music, scope and space can't replace. So I'll leave this bar for you. People come and go, dramatic tides of money flow. A dollar burns as fast, no matter whose hands hold it last. And then it's past, and the record will show our lives wouldn't be what they are now if they weren't what they were then. It's everyone that makes the day, it's not just one lone person. A verse ends and the chorus goes on and on. And the color of the photos used to separate the years, but the kids are bored with progress. They've developed ways to break time, fake time on the walls of the caves we're in. If I make it through the open cages in the zoo, it won't because I'm brave. Fear is power, power saved every day, coming closer to being used. Water flow for me and lead me to my family. Leave the kettle on, the note it plays may start my song. There's nothing wrong with the simple refrain. Our lives wouldn't be what they are now if they weren't what they were then. It's everyone that makes the day, it's not just one lone person. A verse ends and the chorus goes on. Our lives wouldn't be what they are now if they weren't what they were then. It's everyone that makes the day, it's not just one lone person. A verse ends and the chorus goes on and on.